Okay, so let's talk about arms. So, well, arms and fury. So arms and fury are both really, really good at different things. In fact, I think warrior is like one of the best classes of all of the melee to always have a way to deal with something. So I mean, first of all, I can just tell you right now, they're just a class with a clear niche, just straight up. Arms has usually on an expansion basis, this isn't quite true right now, but they have like the best execute in the entire game. It's been true for almost all of BFA. It was like extremely prevalent in bosses like Gahoon, and then again, N'Zoth wasn't like a huge execute thing, but like in that raid, Arms Warriors with Lucid Dreams like had by far the best execute. They still have like really strong execute, but it's more about like 2-target cleave with execute. So like the reason why Warrior was so good for like Denathrius, for example, was because you could like charge back and forth the entire fight. You had leap to get to the platforms. That ended up being really prevalent with where the actual guys spawned, I guess. But I don't know, they were tuned really weak, but they were still good. Like warriors being a class with a clear niche and not being dependent on tuning is so like, here, like look at this. Go to Warcraft logs, go to statistics, Castle Nathria, and let's look at a few bosses, right? So like Shriekwing, Mythic DPS 95th percentile or so. Look at Arms and Fury. They're both like really low, right? That's this close to, like, there's a large drop off, but like it's really hard to look at pure single. Hungering's another fight. They're even lower when it's like over the entire encounter. Maybe look at 75th. Okay, it doesn't really change. Then there's bosses like Sludgefist are really bad to look at. Never look at Sludgefist or pure single because it's just, you know, there's so many damage amps. But I mean, even on the fight that is the most single target dependent the entire instance, although it does give benefit to classes that have huge CDs during damage amps. That's why you see both Convoke specs way near the top, and Affliction is almost exclusively getting PI'd, so it's a little hard to look at. But it's pretty bad, right? Stone Legion General's Fury is really good, or pretty good. What, top 6, top 7 class or so? Maybe a little bit higher if you go up the percentile. Yeah, they jumped to top 6. And then Denathrius, you still are going to see Fury and Arms like pretty much middle of the pack. Actually, not that many specs have actually killed the fight. But it shows you that Arms like was still brought for world first progression in both of our guilds. We had a Prot Warrior, and we still brought an Arms Warrior on Denathrius. We thought the extra rally was good. So they have clear value because they have clear value because they bring a raid buff, and they bring actually no, the best way we should put this is we should have classes with clear value or a niche. That's the play. That makes way more sense because it's literally the same thing. Okay, so and then Fury is the other side of the coin. Fury typically does not have as strong of execute as Arms, but number one, Fury is easier to play. Number two, it's way easier to live. They're way tankier than Arms, and they do like 4 to 5 target sustained AoE. Stone Legion Generals is like a great example, where like there's like right now, so not enough Frost Mages have played this fight yet. I don't know how many things there are, but like in general, like Frost DK, Frost Mage, certainly Windwalker with how powerful Spinning Cranky is right now, are like one of the very few classes that are going to do as much consistent skirmisher damage, consistent commando damage. Maybe not commandos because it's just more bursty, but like anytime you have 4 to 5 targets stacked up over a long period of time. Yeah, 2. I think Fired Up played Frost and topped on our Stone Legion Generals last week as well, because it like just got buffed, right? But it's like top tier for specifically that while being a melee. And then again, this is just talking about their damage profiles, but clearly they bring a raid buff where Prot Warrior, and again, maybe this would be better to do, or I'll make another one of these about tanks to kind of tell, because like clearly right now when you're talking about your class in a raid, like look at like what was brought to progression this raid, right? It was a Demon Hunter tank from us, it was a Prot Warrior tank, right? Those were the 2 tank classes. And then for melee we brought 4 Unholy DKs, right? We brought a Windwalker for a buff, and that was it, right? Isn't that all we brought for melee? I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I think that was literally it, right? We brought 1 warrior just on Denathrius, but sat him for a ton of other fights. So I guess you could say 1 warrior we brought. The reason we brought warrior in general is because we thought they were going to be good from Denathrius. And it, like, for us, we don't bring the best comp for every fight, right? Like when we're killing these early bosses, almost exclusively, Holy Paladin is a DPS. Yeah, I get it. Yeah, that. that we were the reason people, you know, are doing that now, by the way, just so you know that. But the like early bosses were never going to make the comp based on what classes are good for that, right? We're gearing for Denathrius. We knew, as well as other guilds knew, that if Arms was tuned correctly, Arms should be the single best class on Denathrius. It's still not tuned correctly, but it got buffed right before the raid, and we thought it would be enough. In hindsight, I think we actually dropped the Arms Warrior on Denathrius, maybe for either another Windwalker or maybe another ranged. Either way, it would have been fine, but like it didn't really hurt us at all. Like Arms was fine, but Fury has now been buffed a lot since then. In fact, I think going into a raid, I think Fury might be more of the go-to. I think it just has less downsides as a spec, and it's also just easier. I think in other guilds, like especially because warriors are like kind of like the warlocks of melee, or I guess warriors are the warriors of melee, where like most warriors are like huge meatheads, and they just like, they're like me smash. They're like warriors in real life, you know, like they pop berserker rage and like smash shit. So because of that, they typically playing the easier version of the spec will often be better for a lot of players. So I would say Warrior is in that point where it's not just dependent on tuning, because again, brings a raid buff, brings Rallying Cry, and both of its specs, again, it's really rewarding to play a class where you have two specs that have different strengths. That's like super, super nice. Okay, moving on to Havoc DH. So I will put Havoc DH up here. I think Havoc DH was similar to Warrior this raid, where like they're okay. So Havoc DH, first of all, does have a niche. Havoc DH's niches, they do like among the best AoE in the entire game, and that's probably going to continue being more true in the future, because I have a feeling Blizzard's going to keep aura buffing them based on their single target being lacking. That's what we're going to get to in a second. Their single target's really bad, but their AoE is like really, really nice. Also, they're still pretty tanky. They don't have an immunity. A lot of people view Netherwalk as an immunity. That is a bad way to look at it. They do have Meta Leap immunity, but like look at the kind of things you immune in this raid. Like, are people really immuning chains breaking on Shriekwing? Maybe, if you have like a couple people. Is anyone immuning the application of, you know, X ability by leaping? Like I'm sure people would do it, but like it's not like something you build a strat around. Netherwalk is much more correctly looked at as just simply a 100% damage reduction. You're still going to get every debuff when you get it, but it's a really nice spell, but it's not quite an immunity, right? The immunities in this game, like the true immunities, are Ice Block and Bubble, because those will remove debuffs alongside preventing them. And then on Paladins also have Blessing of Protection and Blessing of Spell Warding, which which one of those are Spell Warding for Prot. Those do act as true immunities on the application. However, they will not remove a lot of the things. So Bop will remove some physical debuffs, but Spell Warding will not remove magic debuffs, but make you immune to the damage, but it will immune the application. So it's like, it just works a little bit differently than normal Bop, or like actual Bubble for each of the physical or magical things respectively, whether it's Spell Warding or Protection. Netherwalk is not really like any of that. Netherwalk is very simply, look at it as a 100% damage reduction, and you will way better understand that spell. And then it also has Darkness and a raid buff. So it's kind of hard to say they don't have like clear value. Like if you go into any normal raid, there's a much higher chance you're going to bring a Demon Hunter than you're going to bring one of these melee specs we talk about in a bit that are entirely dependent on tuning, right? So that's why you're going to see historically a lot of Havoc. Like right now, they're not too strong. If you look at logs, right? So like, let's look at Hungering Destroyer, just pure single target. You know, they're in the bottom fourth, right? They're in like the lower end of the spectrum. If you want to separate, is there a way on here to separate it with just melee DPS? There probably isn't. Maybe you could shift click a few at a time, but you know, they're just not in a good spot. Whereas honestly, like I haven't looked at this, but like where are their generals parses? Look, they're a top 6 class on generals. Although it is a little misleading on some of these fights. Like I remember someone making the argument to me recently that Outlaw was super insane on Denathrius, and they were, and people think Windwalker is super insane on Denathrius. But that's like, I feel like a lot of lower ranked guilds look at like sims and parses as like what determines a class's value, right? Like Windwalker Monk isn't going to top last phase in Denathrius. What Windwalker does is if you get good Chi-Ji procs coming out of P1, you'll just be like 3k ahead of every other class in the game. But like P1 damage is quite literally irrelevant. Topping first phase, topping second phase doesn't matter. The only thing that ever mattered on this boss in progression is how much damage you do in P3. That's it. So because of that, they're a much worse class on the fight, but they appear really good. They were probably the single best class on average for the entire rest of the raid, but they're actually like a pretty average Denathrius class, which is pretty weird because, you know, they do a shitload of damage. But again, that's why people think Outlaw. We'll get to Rogues in a second because I'll make that same argument. But yeah, Havoc's a little low right now, and this is kind of where like, but like even then, you'll still probably see Havocs in a lot of raid comps because a lot of guilds don't have the ability to flex a Vengeance Demon Hunter tank. They bring a raid buff. Who knows why raid buffs are in this game? And they also have a raid cooldown. Them and Warriors are the only two classes in all of Melee, and that's why I did them first, that they have a cooldown and a raid buff, which, you know, you could argue that Blizzard should tune based on the fact that some classes down here that are going to be dependent on tuning that we're going to talk about later, like those classes are, they should naturally do more damage than all the classes that have clear value, because like if not, what is their purpose? Or you have to give them value or a niche, right? And right now they don't really have that. They also, Demon Hunters kind of lost their tankiness bit. Like, do you guys remember the argument for rogues back in the day on Gul'dan, like we were just talking about, where people would take a bunch of damage or soak on Gul'dan, and they're just the class that can heal through that the most? I also think they had something that healed them back then for that too. It was like a legendary or something that was like super tanky that kind of enabled that more than something like Feint would. But like Havoc DHs would have been that last expansion. When you one tanked Zakul, you had a Havoc off tank. That Havoc's lost a ton of that passive leech, and Blur got nerfed a lot to where it's not nearly as good in those scenarios. They did lose a little bit of defensiveness, but Darkness is still an insanely good raid cooldown. In fact, I think Darkness on average this raid is actually better than AMZ in a lot of cases. Like where Darkness really shines is not big giant hits, although it's fine on big giant hits, right? It's much better on like slow ticking damage. It's like Sludge Fist is great. You get a big giant hit in it, but also for the duration of Darkness, when you're sitting on these pillars stacked up, your entire raid is getting fucking annihilated by the dot. So like it's just a lot of damage events to where it ends up being a very clear value. And it would have worked on Sludge Fist where AMZ wouldn't. But basically every AMZ in this raid, Darkness is basically just as good. The only time Darkness is not... Oh, also, I'm going to talk about Darkness and Spirit Link in a second, but Darkness... Let's just say you have everyone in your raid is at 100% health. There's no dot damage happening, right? And everyone's getting hit from 100 to 20. Okay, Darkness makes 5 of the 20 people miss just based on its chance to dodge the attack. People are still AoE healing, right? Like you're still healing rain, you're still whatever everyone's spell is. Maybe you're tranking or whatever. So the people who are topped are just going to get overhealed. So that's where Darkness is like, if you look at how people heal, like yes, it's going to show a huge amount of healing when it shows it as an absorb on like damage meters. It's going to show a lot, but it's not actually doing a lot. Where it's insane is bosses like Orgazoa when everyone's stacked and there's just a bunch of random damage going out, or being stacked after a pillar hit on Sludge Fist, being stacked inside of a Darkness after you spawn ads on Mythic Denathrius just for all of their like little AoE damage they're doing, which is like a ton of damage events, stuff like that. Darkness does still work with Spirit Link, but not in the way you would think it would. So how Spirit Link works is it does two things. It multiple times a second, it will take the people who are high in your raid and it will do damage to them. And then the people who are low in your raid, it will heal them, and it just balances everyone's raid, or balances everyone's health in the raid. But how it actually works is it does damage to some people and it heals some people. What Darkness used to do with Spirit Link is not only would Darkness give you a 20% chance to miss your incoming damage you were taking normally, but it would also give you a 20% chance to miss the Spirit Link redirecting your health if you were topped. So that just made Spirit Link even more insane. Like it was like a heal. Basically, Spirit Link was actually healing you as well before Spouting Spirits was the thing, because it would miss the people redirecting their health. That does not work anymore. That has been fixed. It's still a really good cooldown to use together, because let's just say you're using Spirit Link and Darkness in tandem and you're taking a huge hit like we talked about earlier, like 100 to 20%. An optimal use of Darkness is with Spirit Link there, because the people who are at 100% are now actually really helping you because they're redirecting your health to all of the people who are really low. Then Darkness becomes much better, but not in the same way it used to work. So Demon Hunters right now, very bad single target. really good AoE. There, honestly, I think people are like looking pretty dim on Havoc right now, and it's possible that it's not really top tier for the rest of the expansion, but I think it's like one really strong single target buff away from being like stacked in raids. I think it's really powerful. It also becomes something to stack with AMZ, and we'll talk about DKs next. But like, for example, if you have 2 DKs versus 1 DK and 1 Demon Hunter, you have the option to use Darkness and AMZ together, where using 2 AMZs together doesn't really do anything. Although in most fights you can find the ability to use AMZ sometime later, and also AMZ is a minute shorter cooldown for some reason. But yeah. All right, so moving on to DK. So this is class with clear value or niche, and boy does it have a lot of value, and boy does it have a few niches as well. Okay, so or I guess maybe I could leave this over here and we'll just make a new DK. So this class, before this tier, it got nerfed before the tier, but before it did get nerfed, it had the best execute in the game. Right now I think it's very slightly second, but it's still really good with Soul Reaper. Here's all the things DK can do. When you talk about like what in raiding, there are things that your class does that makes you like top tier. I think the best one to look at is Hunter, right? A lot of people think Hunter's like OP right now in raids, and it's very, very good, but it's for one reason. It's for Wild Spirits. If Hunter did not have the niche of having the strongest 4 to 5 target burst in the entire game by a lot, it would be like a very mediocre spec. It's not bringing you a raid buff. It has, generally speaking, like the weakest immunity of all of them, even though it is still an immunity. And then they're the squishiest raid class in just overall raid damage, by far, actually. So if they did not have the very, very strong niche that is Night Fae Wild Spirits, and it wasn't as good as it was, they would be a class entirely dependent on tuning and very suboptimal, unless specifically their single target was tuned really high, right? So like that's when we're talking about like a class's niche, that's a good example of one where it's like, it seems like it's so good, but it's actually literally one ability that makes them that good. DKs have a million things that make them good. The obvious thing is AMZ, right? Everyone knows about AMZ. I think the most egregious thing about AMZ actually isn't the fact that it exists on both tanks and DPS, or that it's a 20% reduction. It's actually that it's a 2-minute cooldown. The fact that it's 2 minute is like, why is it a 2-minute cooldown? Like, I don't know. It's just so strange. But they have that. They have the ability to not get knocked back through anything. They have 10% more health than every class in the game. They can death strike through most raid damage that comes to them in a situation where you need to have someone soak something and not die. It hasn't been prevalent for a while. And there are fights like Sludge Fist, for example, where so much of the damage is environmental. And I don't know if you know how environmental damage works with things like Old Frenzied Regen or current Death Strike or Demon Hunter Healing, is that if it's sourced from the environment and not a target, it doesn't actually increase the healing you do with any of those spells, making Death Strike pretty bad. Yeah, they have that. This is just Unholy for now. Unholy has the ability to have really, really consistent mass AoE, and it's only dependent on the runic power bar. Has nothing to do with like most other classes having like 30 to 45 to 1 minute CDs for like small AoE burst. They have like, it's 20 target capped on the initial hit, and then I think 8 target capped, I think, for the secondary splash of how Epidemic works. But you know, it's just basic. It's pretty close to uncapped AoE, basically only on their resource, which is just super powerful for something like the first phase of Denathrius, right? It's just really strong. They have a really, really strong execute. The one thing, maybe like the two things going into this expansion that really put DK over the edge besides AMZ is the fact that their mastery now increases their pet damage. Whereas last expansion for single target as an Unholy DK, you wanted to play haste verse, basically because your pets did so much damage. And when you wanted to do like mass AoE in dungeons, which they've now nerfed, you wanted to play mastery. But now they've made it so mastery, the thing you used to stack for AoE, is now the thing you stack for your single target, which is maybe the most broken thing. And they've nerfed it a lot, but it's still like such an insane change, right? And then yeah, the other thing is execute. Frost DK was really, really good for every boss in progression last expansion. We had one for all of our progression in Old Year, all of our progression in BOD, all of our progression in Eternal Palace, and we ended up including the last boss, and we sat them for the end of the last boss in all 3 raids. 4 raids, including Nyalotha, for the exact reason. When it came to killing the hardest boss on Mythic World first, the class simply fell off at the hardest point of the fight, which is almost always single target and more specifically execute damage, where Frost had insanely good cleave. In Nyalotha, for example, they had Chill Streak from their PvP essence that made them like super strong for Thought Harvester damage, but they just always fell off when it came to be what was most important. Now with Unholy being meta, that's no longer a thing. Unholy is in such an amazing spot. And then on top of all of that, you have AMZ. So that's just Unholy. Frost, actually, with the recent buffs, is doing pretty well. I guess we can just look at logs for a general amount of things here. Let's go down to 75th percentile because a lot of people play DK and it's fairly easy to play. So it should rank higher in the 75th than it would 95th in my guess. Yeah, it drops a rank. So you look at a boss like Stone Legion Generals. Unholy is here and Frost is here, although there's very few Frost logs to my knowledge. Yeah, 2. Atlas played Frost DK after the buffs with, like, you know, not even optimized weapons last week. And I think was 2nd DPS. So I think Frost DK might be better for Stone Legion's progression right now, which is very similar, if you remember us talking about it, is like Arms to Fury, right? Where like Unholy is what you're playing for a while, and Unholy is certainly good for that fight. Not bad at all. I think Frost might be a little better because it's better at all the things that's like dual wield Frost specifically. It's better than all the things Unholy is of that fight for what's important. They're going to have better commando AoE because they have their dragon every time. They're going to have more consistent skirmisher damage inside of every phase, while the Unholy DK will have more consistent single target Goliath and boss damage. But like that's not as important in that fight. It's mainly a control fight. Yeah, you'll have breath and the like Cinder Ghost's Fury or the dragon or whatever. Every time you're AoEing commandos, it's like probably as valuable as Wild Spirits for specifically that mechanic in the fight. And that's a pretty common white point even after the changes too. You look at a boss like Hungering. Unholy is still decently strong. It's also one of the best PI targets, specifically on the pull and specifically with Lust, with Army. It's not as strong outside of that at all. But as you can see, Unholy DK single target's kind of fallen off. You know, outside of an execute phase, they're actually not very good single target. That's including the fact that a lot of them get PIs as well. So if this goes to show you, Unholy DK, even though it was stacked this raid, just know that even though their damage was great, and before they were nerfed right before the raid, they were like the best damage in the game by far. They are no longer the best damage in the game, but they're still like going for the rest of the expansion. I find it hard to believe that there will be anything less than 2 Death Knights on any fight for the rest of the expansion, whether it's Blood and Frost or Unholy or whatever. Like, doing a mythic raid boss on progression without the current form of AMZ just seems crazy to me. And that includes if they nerf it to 15%. That includes if they nerf it to a 4-minute CD. That includes like all that stuff. Like, it is just so powerful. To where maybe that slot in the raid, this raid, could be kind of competitive between Havoc and DK, because I think Darkness and AMZ are really similar. It just kind of just depends on where their tuning ends up. But they obviously have, they pose to have very clear value regardless. But also Frost is up and coming, man. Only thing with Frost, single target, definitely not good. But its cleave is just super strong. All right. So last class that has, I think this is the last class that has clear value or niche, is Windwalker Monk. So right now, it's hard to tell because like you guys, right before this raid, Windwalker was destitute because it was probably the worst class in Nyalotha and maybe one of the worst classes in multiple years prior. It was actually just so bad. But they just do everything right now. I don't know. If I were to design a class with good progression cooldowns, it would be Monk, man. Like, you have insanely good burst, you have insanely good 4-5 target cleave, you have one ability that hits really hard that's uncapped, which is why they do so well in P1, Whirling Dragon Punch of Denathrius. Yeah, they're just, I don't know, man. They're unkillable. They've always been unkillable. If you guys have a friend that ever made the take that like Windwalkers were squishy in Mythic Plus, that guy is bad, or you're bad if you think that. Dude, actually, no. Don't take it from me. I need you guys to do this. If you guys have ever thought Windwalkers have been squishy for the past like 3 or 4 years, go into Darky's stream right now or the next time he's live and ask him what he thinks of Windwalkers who ever thought the class was squishy, and you'll learn the good news. They have, even before they got Fort Brew, that class was unkillable. Extremely good defensives. And also they have unlimited movement. But they're real, there's 2 things that make them have a clear value. Number 1, clear value or niche. They have a buff. They have a buff you need to bring to the raid. Right now, Brewmaster is pretty suboptimal in a raid scenario. It's fine, but it's just like, it does like pretty good damage, but I mean, it's clearly worse defensively than like the top 2 to 3 tanks at the moment in all fights, basically. They have good movement, but like Windwalker is basically the shit. I mean, I would honestly even bring Windwalker even if it was slightly weaker, just because its progression CDs are so good. You can always save a clone. You can always save a Storm Earth and Fire for something important. You know, it's just really nice. If I were to have my wish for the rest of the expansion, is that you would never play Brewmaster and always play Windwalker. I think Windwalker is just such a good class to do all the right things. Just such a good balanced damage profile, and it has 2 minutes. 2 minutes are like really OP. Windwalker's skill cap is high? I don't know. But I mean, it definitely does matter on tuning though. Like, well, all these classes matter with tuning. It's just some classes, it's all that matters. But yeah. Also, like, I guess there's some argument for Ring of Peace. Right now, they're still doing really strong. Their single target has fallen off a lot. So like, I like to look at 95th percentile, 75th percentile bosses like Hungering Destroyer. They've kind of fallen to the middle of the pack with tuning. LA Shaman's really strong. Shadow Priest really strong. Feral Druid somehow is still really strong. It has like pretty few logs compared to other things. Like, for example, as you see, like Affliction logs have over like 13k. Like there's only like 800 Feral logs or something. But I mean, that class consistently owns, and that's with most likely complete geezers playing Feral Druid. Generally speaking, classes that are not meta, the really, really insane PvE players in the world that are FODM usually don't play a class unless it's good enough. So probably a lot of geezers playing Feral and other random melee specs. So Feral, my only point being is not to flame Feral players. It's that Feral Druid's actually probably better than this is the point. Windwalker, yeah, basically mid-tier, but brings a raid buff. But if you look at AoE, they're untouchable. Again, Denathrius isn't an important... Again, Windwalkers do a ton of damage on Denathrius, but it's kind of sneaky. Again, the kind of damage they do just isn't important, right? If you go to Windwalker logs on that fight, and if you look at the first 2 phases, they will destroy every class in the game. If you look at the last phase, they're middle of the pack. Middle of the pack in the last phase is the only thing that matters. So they're about middle of the pack on Denathrius. But still really strong, and can't die, and have unlimited movement, and have a raid buff. Clear value. Okay, so the specs we have left. We have Survival Hunter. We have Rep Paladin. We have all 3 specs of Rogue. We have Feral Druid. We have Enhanced Shaman. For you guys who are looking at these last classes, what do you think is the one class that has a niche of all of these? And so just to be clear, value would be having something that no other class can bring. Niche would be doing a certain type of damage that no other class can bring. All right, you guys are getting it. It's actually Enhance. I don't know if you guys have looked at Enhance recently, but Enhance has a pretty decent damage. So like Denathrius, they do okay. Stone Legion Generals, they're like, cleave is not very strong, but on a boss like Hungering, they're pretty low, huh? That's not good. Again, there are currently geezers playing Enhance. But I don't like they possess one thing that other classes don't. They have Wind Fury Totem. Now, Wind Fury Totem, I think a lot of people are like, yeah, put it in your group with your tanks. It's not good enough. The class does not become good enough based on just that. But even if you look at simply Hungering Destroyer logs, they give Arms Warriors a 7% the last time I checked. Single target buff to 1 player, okay, by giving Wind Fury Totem. So there will be a time in this expansion, I'm telling you right now, where Shaman's spot, again, this is all optimally, mind you. This has nothing to do with, like, can we run this? You can run all these classes whenever you want, you know? But, like, this is just optimal mythic progression, dude. If Arms Warrior is ever meta, and by meta, I mean, like, they're up here on single target like they have been in multiple tiers over the history of WoW, Enhanced Shaman is going to be a required raid buff. And also Havoc DH with Demon's Blades is also pretty decent. So again, it's hard to look at right now because Havoc and Arms are both in the bottom of single target and enhance. So it doesn't, again, it's not the best argument for enhance. But I'm telling you, there's going to be a time in this expansion when arms is really, really good for a lot of the reasons we talked about. And shaman is in. If you're running 2 or more arms warriors, you're most likely going to play an enhance. Think about that. It's really good. Even though the class isn't that good, they have that. They're also Astral Shift is tanky. Ankh is underrated. Like they're not a bad class, right? They also bring Speed Totem. Even in a scenario where you're already bringing Resto Shamans, which when we go over our healing meta thing, like you'll see that Resto Shamans are like really, really, really strong and they're brought a lot. But bringing a Speed Totem from a DPS Shaman just means something like a healer Shaman can have a shorter Spirit Walker's Grace or something, right? On fights, stuff like that's pretty nice. All right, so here are the classes that are dependent on tuning. We'll start with Ret, because a lot of people thought Ret would go into the clear value. Not really in this expansion. So they do really, really good AoE. They're also one of the top targets for PI, meaning that PI increases their damage by a percentage, specifically with their 2 minutes on CD for a whole fight, to a certain amount to where it's pretty strong, but it's just not. Like I think people gave Ret more credit than it deserved last expansion, even though Ret was fine in almost every raid. Ret was really only mainly used, like when we brought a Ret to our comp, number one, we have a very, very good Ret player, but he can play anything. The other thing is that in Jaina and Eternal Palace on Ashara, those were the 2 raids we brought a Ret Paladin. I think we brought one on Azoth as well, but that's only because of the immunity requirement. But obviously like another Fire Mage would have been better, right? If we would have prepared properly. But there was a reason we brought it on Ashara and there was a reason we brought it on Jaina, right? Ret's got that huge buff when people died. And that's still kind of a niche, I guess. So last expansion you would put that there. But them nerfing it just to give you wings for a short duration is not as powerful as that old buff used to be, which is why I put them from the top niche down to dependent on tuning. Because you literally brought them to progression, because the answer was in the hardest part of the hardest boss, which is the last phase of Jaina and Ashara, you knew for a fact that people would be dying very often on purpose. So again, Ret would have probably been very low represented in World First rating content last expansion. But it's even more so now, because like the one thing that made them insane, again, when you guys look at a whole raid, like we were talking about with Windwalker is so strong over the course of the raid because it's so strong at certain things, and it's so strong on logs on Denathrius, but it's not actually that insane at what's important. Ret was insane at what's important. Ret was like on those 2 bosses, those 2 end bosses on Mythic and WoW, they were posed to be the best class at that phase because of the death thing. Now that's not as much of a thing. So they're dependent on tuning. There's not too many raid slots. DKs and Demon Hunters bring raid cooldowns and other melee don't. So unless... Now again, it's possible you see Ret. It's possible at some point in this expansion when they add 2 legendaries, and it's possible when they add, you know, just other random systems or allow you maybe to have a second Covenant ability. Like maybe, like obviously things are going to be thrown through whack, and it's possible that they do the highest single target. And if it's possible that Ret is ever the highest single target, then it'll be brought. But until then, I think it's very unlikely you see a Ret Paladin in progression in this expansion, just because of that. And Warriors give raid CD, yeah. Although I will say, I think AMZ and Darkness are definitely more powerful than Rally. There are bosses when Rally is fucking insane, and there's bosses where Rally is like clearly worse. All right, Rogue. So Rogue is in a bad spot right now. Outlaw's really good. The only issue with it having a niche is that Outlaw does really good consistent cleave on a low amount of targets. Right? So it's not AoE caps, or it is AoE caps, sorry. But that's not as much as Windwalker. It's not as much as Windwalker's cleave. It's maybe more consistent than like clones and like spinning crank kick, especially when people are like low on energy, but like they just kind of get outclassed there. They get outclassed by like Unholy DK with Epidemic as well, like in raid fights specifically. But like on a fight like Stone Legion Generals, like Outlaw's like really strong. I don't know where it ends up on logs. Like Outlaw's like actually really good at this fight. We were considering running Outlaw before the raid for both Generals and Denathrius. It's just not strong. It's simply outclassed by classes already. Like this is the issue with Rogue. It's just dependent on tuning in every sense of the word. It is just straight up outclassed damage wise by classes that bring a raid cooldown. How could you ever bring it? if you want to make the argument that they're just insane at soaking, when was the last time they were insane at soaking, right? It was Tomb of Sargeras and then in Nighthold. So in Nighthold, you had them eat a bunch of souls from the middle of the well in P3 of Gul'dan, or I guess P2 of Gul'dan. But the reason they were so good at that is the Faint Legendary actually healed them. That's no longer a thing in the game. Or Sargeras, whatever, dude. And then I guess immunity soaking, they were just really, really strong on Fallen Avatar and Kil'jaeden. But I don't know if you guys have noticed, but since then, they've never had a fight be like that since. In fact, they've also changed lead fight designers multiple times since then, and it just hasn't been a thing. It's possible, but other classes can facilitate the same thing that rogues used to do for cloak soaking. Like Havoc Demon Hunters, they can't actually immune it, or they can very infrequently, but like at just taking the damage over a long period of time, like the dot you used to take is just it, or just the one that increases the damage of your next thing. It just hasn't been important in raiding for a long time. Now let's look at the other specs. So Sub lost its niche. Sub used to have the biggest niche on the planet. It had the best funnel, and we're going to talk more about funnel when we do this for ranged. So what funnel is when you have like 5 targets and you only care about damage to one of them, so you use the other 4 targets or the other 5 targets just to buff your damage into that one. Examples of this in the past, most notably, is Sub Rogue on Zul. You would just Fan of Knives and then Eviscerate over and over and over again and just use those targets as a funnel into your main target. Ellie Shaman with Fulmination and Lava Burst spam from Lava Shocks on multiple targets. Last expansion, Frost Mages currently, in fact, Frost Mages are currently the strongest funnel in the game, where you have like Frozen Orb on 5 to 6 targets, but you're just pummeling Ice Lances into one of them with the Legendary. That's what funnel is. That's been removed from Sub. It doesn't exist. Also, another big one is Enhance. Enhanced Shaman used to do that back in Highmaul and that expansion, but that's been nerfed. Slash, I think that ability just like doesn't exist anymore. So Sub kind of lost that. So they're just a single target spec, but how could you ever levy bringing a single target spec when other classes do similar single target, like the few of them up here, but they just have AoE? You can't, like, Sub doesn't compete with these classes in PvE. All right, now Assassination just recently got buffed. In fact, strangely enough, I think the spec with more changes that has the best chance of getting Rogue into a Mythic raid this expansion is actually Assassination. A lot of people don't like playing Assassination, but it has really good like multi-target cleave. It's like kind of high IQ, like low combo point ruptures that, you know, obviously you want it to like expire right after the mob dies. So like you get maximum ticks while also giving you the energy return. So it's like pretty efficient in raiding environments specifically without mass AoE, but it also has execute. That's the important thing. Assassination has the execute legendary. It's not very strong right now, and its execute isn't very strong, but mythic raid progression, big burst around their 2 minutes, so Vendetta, and then also their if it gets strong enough, and then their execute could be something that gets them into a raid. Like for example, historically, let's look at a boss like Sire Denathrius, right? Looking at over the last like 3 to 4 years, when you have a boss like that, the last phase is a 2 minute and 20 second or 2 minute and 30 second execute burn. You're going to see like Assassination has routinely been like one of the best classes in the game for that. And keep in mind his execute, like Assassination execute starts at 30%. So it's like a lot of it's in execute, and you're going to have perfect 2 minute timing. So it's pretty good. So again, rogues right now are not in the best spot, but yeah. And then you have Feral Druid. So they don't bring a raid buff. They don't have a raid cooldown. They do have a really, really cool covenant. And they are dependent on tuning. Right now, they're tuned extremely well. Feral Druid on not Denathrius, because like their AoE isn't that great in the first phase. But first of all, Feral actually does have funnel at the moment with Ferocious Bite Legendary. They don't do as much AoE, but like pure single target, Feral is like slapping right now. Don't look at a boss like Sludge Fist, because Sludge Fist is like such a unique situation where they're already a high single target class, but then they just have Convoke, right? But like look at this. Look at this, dude. 95th percentile Feral Druid, 9k. There's also 20 parses, so that's part of it. But the class is like really, really good on that fight specifically. And then on Hungering, it's like top 3 with a couple other specs for single target. And it's also a class that isn't getting PI'd a lot. Feral Druid is very strong right now. But the reason why you don't see a lot of hype around it is because it's only dependent on that. If you start adding 2 legendaries, or if you start adding some kind of like extra form of borrowed power that we don't know about in the next coming patch, which is, by the way, when we're looking for. Like, this is how it is currently. A lot of this will change. I'll probably update this at some point. So Feral Druid's really good right now, but it's possible that it won't in the future. Like I said, it brings Roar, but usually better specs bring Roar. I think Feral would maybe be more liked if Moonkin wasn't as good. Like, Moonkin is just so unbelievably good right now. All right, so almost all melee are done. We are missing one melee, and I'm gonna need chat's help. I have no idea what this class does. I've never raided with a survival hunter, and I think it kind of goes to show you why I don't know anything about it, because I feel like if I knew what survival hunter did, I would have a better, like if you look at logs, right? Like, it's obviously like near the bottom, but it's another thing where geezers are playing it most likely. So like, it's probably better than this, because like I do not know of a single like good player in like a high guild that plays survival, so not one of them. So although I'm sure they exist. All right, so I'm gonna hear this from chat. This is not knowledge that I know. And I think it's important to mention that if survival did anything significant that made it really... Now, I don't want you guys to tell me like, oh, well, it does like AoE. Yeah, but if it doesn't do the best AoE in the game, that's not a niche. If it does AoE, that's fine. Every class is AoE. It would need to do like really strong uncapped AoE. Like, what are the most popular niches, right? It's like 2 to 3 targets spread out DPS. It's really strong burst AoE. It's execute. It's funnel. It's target swapping. It's like quick 5-second burst on a short CD. Stuff like that. I think survival is tuning dependent, and it has been for years, but I want someone to convince me otherwise. It does the best single target DPS of any melee hunter spec in the game. Holy shit, that got me good. Holy shit, that got me good. He isn't wrong. No, that's a fact. It does have execute. Yeah. Survival hunter is just so weird, because it's just like, why, dude? Just make it like a tank spec or something. I don't know. No, because people are gonna take that like, I always get complaints when I talk about survival, because people are like, dude, you're giving like a bad input to the community. Like, there are survival hunter players and people hear you say this stuff and don't want to bring them. It's like, dude, I'm sure there's great survival hunter players. You should play survival if you want to play survival. I'm just saying, it's like the fucking weirdest spec in the game. So, old ranged version of survival with Black Arrow and Explosive Shot was so fun, and they took it and removed a range spec just to... There are less range specs in the game than there were in Classic, and they've added like 10 melee specs, and there's like usually 9 to 10 ranged in a raid and like 4 to 5 melee in a raid, but there's more melee specs than range specs. It makes no sense. Like, it makes no sense for survival to be a melee spec. Make it a tank spec, or make it the old range spec it used to be, which was actually like a really fun spec. You know what I mean? That would be my survival thoughts.